All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Here we are, our final lunch today. And a lovely moment that we have to look forward to here. I hope you've had a good morning of sessions. I certainly participated in a couple that were very, very wonderful. I don't know if I should say that since one of them was mine, but I did enjoy it. So we passed out some raffle tickets as you came in order to give away some free books. If you didn't get one and would like one, simply raise your hand and Allison or Sarah will. I see over here that is that Chris that has her hand up that didn't get okay, so we have a few hands up. People didn't get their raffle tickets. All right. Okay, great. So it's my great pleasure again to introduce the introducer. So I'm happy to introduce Pamela Flash, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today. And so Pamela, I invite you to the podium to do the honors. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. In the address we're about to hear, Linguistic Justice, Rights, Policies, and Practices from a Transnational Perspective, Dr. Ligia Mihut, cultural researcher, language scholar, activist, and teacher, will further our thinking about linguistic justice and language pluralism. The approach he's about to describe simultaneously incorporates two central moves: exposing monolingual standards and actively integrating cross-cultural rhetorics and translingual writing in the classroom. In her ongoing research, Dr. Mihut unpacks and theorizes the intellectual and emotional work that we do as what she calls literacy brokers. And she spotlights the unique position of transnational scholars in promoting pedagogical change and linguistic pluralism. So aren't you glad you stayed? Dr. Mihut is Associate Professor of English at Barry University, which is in Miami Shores, Florida. After receiving an MA in TESOL and a PhD in English with a writing studies specialization from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, she has actively pursued research interests in immigrant literacies and rhetorics, linguistic justice, and transnationalism. Drawing on her 2 years of ethnographic research into immigrant literacies in the city of Chicago, Dr. Mihut is currently working on a book called Immigrants, Brokers, and Literacy as Affinity, which is an exploration of literacy's entanglement in networks of economic and political frames. Last year, she gave us a taste of this with her C's article, The Politics of Co-Brokering, Mediation and Affinity in Critical Times. As a co-recipient of a 4C's Research Initiative Award, she's also been involved in a comparative study of writing practices in 4 different countries: Romania, Nepal, India, and Colombia. Finally, Dr. Mihut has been involved in the 4C's Transnational Composition Standing Group for the last 8 years and has served as this group's chair for the past 3 years. She is a fabulous connection for those of us who are interested in pursuing research in this transnational linguistic area. We're lucky to be the beneficiaries of her wide-ranging multidisciplinary research and practice. So please help me welcome to the podium, Dr. Mihut.
Thank you for being here for the last session on the last day. You are the strong at heart. You're strong in the body, and I really value your endurance because it does speak highly to the commitments that you have, or probably to the plans you've already made in advance. I was really impressed with Julia Chen's mention of being an opera singer. I do not have that talent, but I am a gym addict. And I'm not going to do anything crazy this afternoon, but there is one particular exercise that came to mind, and it's called planking. It's when you hold your body in a steady position in order to increase endurance and to tighten your muscles. So basically, my talk today is an exercise in planking, in mental and also physical, because our bodies are tired. So plank with me as we are finishing this conference stronger and I think more enduring in all of our practices. In 2001, I came on a visit in the US only a couple of months after the 9/11 attack. I needed medical advice on an eye problem I had since birth. A few friends from Greenville, South Carolina, arranged the details of my visit, and I got to visit them again a couple of days ago. The medical consultation, the travel expenses, lodging, and everything else. Before my arrival, I had to request a tourist visa at the US Embassy in Bucharest, Romania. At the time, I was an English teacher in my early 20s, and I made my way to the US Embassy with all the necessary documents. The most important was proof of employment. This was my way of showing that I had attachments to Romania and I was not going to overstay my visa, and I didn't. In case you're wondering. I waited my turn with anticipation and a good dose of anxiety. As I made my way to the window, the officer and the interpreter welcomed me, and the conversation started through the mediation of the interpreter. This was unexpected because I spoke English fluently. However, I stayed silent and I simply followed with a question-answer protocol. It started with basic questions, and after that, we proceeded to medical-related questions. To my surprise, right after I would give my answer in Romanian, the interpreter would translate my answer and then proceed with additional commentary. But I'm not so sure, or that's unlikely. With his comments, not sure. He simply invalidated my account. You can imagine this was both hilarious and a bit frustrating. I was dealing with a real yet unusual medical problem, and the interpreter simply did not believe my account. The interview continued until at one divine moment, the officer finally read my application, and under employment, where I listed my job and the fact that I was an English teacher. He looked up and for the first time engaged me directly in English. So you speak English? Yes, I do. He dismissed the interpreter. I want you to stay here, please. And we continued our conversation in English. I presented my case in detail, no editorializing, just facts. My plea was successful and I was granted a visa for my visit. I begin with this personal account because it is a story of power, of access, and linguistic justice. My knowledge of English opened a door for me that others tried to block. I became my own advocate in a case of unequal power dynamics, in a system already set in its tracks to silence or confine the petitioner to a set role with little influence. I start with this account as a way to show that there are systems of power set in place before one even sets foot on American soil. There are systems of linguistic power before students make it to our classroom, while they are in our classroom, and after they leave. For this reason, we need to consider linguistic justice approaches throughout systems and processes to address problems of inequity. In this talk, I invite you to go back with me 50 years and to follow the first significant language policy in our field, students' right to their own language. This resolution, let me go back, okay. Both changed the face of our profession and left it somewhat the same. As we examine this contradiction, we need to look at its history and impact on practices and other language rights policies. And that's basically what my talk is about today. Students' right to their own language. And I just actually have the statement here, the resolution that was published in 1974. But we're going to go a little bit through the history and the process of how it came to be a policy. In the fall of 1971, more than 50 years ago, 4Cs officers appointed a committee to draft the language resolution. This action was initiated in response to the socio-historical changes in the nation at the time. That moment in history, marked by the effects of social movements, the assassination of Dr. King, and the Black Power, is crucial. It led to changes not only for African Americans, but it also stirred equal rights movement for women and other minorities. Due to the laborious work of the first Committee on Language Justice that started in 1971, and this is my label of it as the first linguistic justice resolution, what we now know as students' right to their own language, the first draft of the resolution was born a year later in 1972. And we can see here the resolution. A quick overview of this work from 71, when it first started, when the committee first started to work on it, through 74, when it was actually not only approved by SEAS officers, but the membership at SEAS, shows a few important lessons for us today. It shows that change within the system is important work. It is slow work and it is persistent work. So let's start with the first one. Change within the system is important work. I'm saying this because we learn from the background on students' right that winds of change weren't particular to 4Cs. Smitherman 95 explains that the change for equal rights fired work across professional organizations. And I'm glad that there are scholars here that I'm sure they actually lived this. I just read about it. So it's wonderful to meet and to know those scholars. I'm fortunate for that. So the work went across professional organizations, NCTE, 4Cs, MLA, APA, SCA, Speech Communication Association, ABA, American Bar Association, and, quote, across disciplines and throughout academia, unquote. A convergence of efforts across academia and within disciplines created a momentum for change. This work became significant because it moved stakeholders to take action and address inequity from the top down. I'm not saying that's the only important work, but I'm saying that they were influential in how they positioned conversations about language justice. Unfortunately, work within the system also means obstacles, stoppages, or deviations. Between 71 and 74, efforts were made to work with NCTE to obtain support of SEA's language resolution. And while SEAS is somewhat politically independent, structurally is part of NCTE. But that did not happen. NCTE eventually passed a weaker version of students' right, and their hesitation also limited the initial resolution's impact. Number two, change within the system is slow work. And here I can approach slow in very different ways. And one way in which I'm approaching it is how we move from theory, from concepts to practice. After the passing of students' rights resolution, in first approval in 72 and then in 74 by the membership of SEAS, excuse me, SEAS executive thought it necessary that there's for background work. So in 72, when they first approved it, they wanted more background work that would support and expand and explain the concept stipulated in the resolution. For this reason, another committee was formed that worked on a background document on language variation, teaching and learning, etc., including a bibliography of 129 entries. In this document, 15 issues were addressed in the form of questions. So we have some of these questions include, what do we mean by dialect? How do we acquire dialect? Why do some dialects have more prestige than others? Does dialect affect the ability to read? Does dialect affect the ability to write? Does dialect limit the ability to think? And of course, these are just a few. They're not all of the 15, but I just wanted you to see a selection of them. Despite the usefulness of this background document, 4Cs finds, rightfully so, that more support is needed to encourage the implementation of students' right to into the classroom. That's the next step. As the next step, 4C's executive charged a new committee after committee work, to focus on practice. And this is, by practice, we mean the teaching activities, mini lessons, practical guides for the implementation of students' rights. After 4 years of work from 76 to 1980s, unfortunately, SEAS wavered in its support of the resolution in practice and decided not to publish the document. Sociopolitical context had shifted during this time toward a more conservative stance, and students' right, unfortunately, remained a theoretical document, at least for a while. In many ways, then, the resolution captures the contradiction that I alluded to earlier. A discrepancy between the promise of a great change and no meaningful change in practice, a mismatch between theory and practice. But students' right accomplished something beyond theory-praxis dichotomy. First, by proclaiming linguistic rights, even in their theoretical form, the resolution helped create a path for affirming other languages beyond African-American vernacular. In fact, in her 95 article, Smitherman explains the resolution's role in setting the stage for new linguistic justice actions. And this is what Geneva Smitherman says. We are now in a period, this is in 95, so we're still a few years back, a few decades back. We are now in a period of a new paradigm shift from a provincial, more narrowly conceived focus to a broader internationalist perspective. We thus are being forced to address the issue of multiple linguistic voices, not only here, but in the global family. NCTE and 4Cs, having grappled with these issues through the students' right era, is, I think, well positioned for a leadership role in formulating a national language policy for this nation. So we see here a move both to go nationwide, but also international, okay? And I'm interested in the international here, evidently. Since 95, there have been some efforts to continue the work of students' right with an internationalist perspective. A noticeable, even if contested at times, paradigm shift toward the valorization of multiple languages and dialects occurred more prominently with work published in the early 2000s. And here I have just okay. Let's see. This is some of the work that has been published. These are the landmark articles that a lot of folks have been citing with the transnational term. So, like with the students' right, the emphasis has been on theoretical underpinnings, and despite isolated examples, pedagogical suggestions remained rather limited. From students' right, I have learned that there must be intentional work on practice, whether that's pedagogy, whether that's publication, and in any area of what we mean by practice. To this end, including research, by the way. So, you know, when I say practice, it means a lot of things. Because I've noticed that we keep failing, we keep advancing theories, but we keep failing to focus on practice, I began to look at practices that show linguistic justice. So here's a list of my research. So about 8 years ago, I started more work on pedagogy. So I just listed a couple of projects that I've been working on. I first started with my own pedagogy practice. And at the time, I actually developed my own statement on linguistic pluralism that I integrated into my syllabi. So it started with, it was meant for my students. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It was meant to just come to show students what kind of language rights they have in my classroom. So very small scale. And then from 16 through the 2019, I started looking at blog posts on pedagogy because I was working at the time more closely with the social media team of the Transnational Composition Group. So again, I was interested in, we were talking about translingual and transnational, and I was interested in how that was taken up in pedagogy. And then I started collecting student writing at Berry University from the class where I integrated that syllabus statement on language rights. So I collected over 200 papers, and whenever I was teaching the class, I kept adding more to it. And then finally, one project that I've been involved in for the last few years now is pedagogical practices on writing pedagogical practices of transnational scholars in Romania, Nepal, India, and Colombia. So this research on pedagogy from the last 8 years, as shown here, has allowed me to observe where linguistic justice is present, where it is lacking, and what I can do to address the latter. In short, I'm going to present some observations from this research. This is like multiple strands of research, as you can see. So in 2015, the transnational composition SIG at the time, it was moving towards a standing group position. So for that reason, they were looking for all sorts of blog posts in order to increase the group's mission and visibility. So that's one set of data that I mentioned earlier. My analysis of those blogs on translingual and transnational pedagogy, together with my research on transnational scholars' work in the 4 countries that I mentioned, is synthesized in a few key points. So what I found out is that transnational scholars engage beliefs about language standards and writing, such as language ideologies and views on writing in the classroom. So again, this is, they don't just talk to other scholars about language ideologies, they talk with their students about language ideologies and included videos as pedagogical tools in order to address language standards. Number 2, they critique US-based methods of writing instruction and assignments. For instance, discussion-based seminars, lectures, the teaching of standard grammar, argument-based papers, genre expectations. Number 3, transnational scholars develop cross-cultural and global-oriented curricula. I've noticed the integration of cross-cultural themes, readings, readings on global citizenship, on socio-political issues that were transnational in nature, and so on and so forth, transcultural knowledge, and a lot more. So number 4, they display a commitment to cross-linguistic approaches to diverse rhetorical traditions, and they also engage with national and global reforms. And this number 4, you may be tempted to say, well, that's kind of similar to number 3. The distinction here is that number 4 is a lot bigger. It covers, its expansion is much broader than number 3. And one observation that I'm going to emphasize later is that this is mostly typical of transnational scholars in transnational spaces, so beyond the US. And number 5, transnational scholars' own trajectory of their scholarly development, the languages they speak, their mentors, their affiliations, determine largely the role they play in engaging transnational and linguistic justice issues. So from this research on pedagogy, I formulated my own conception of linguistic justice approach. And this is the reason why I actually chose to introduce to you this conception so late in my talk, because in a way, I wanted you to see that I didn't just come up with it out of thin air, but it was a process. And I think that's important for us to understand, that it's a process of thinking, it's a process of practice of how we think about this. Okay, so I apologize that I made you wait, but it was so that you see that it's derived from my analysis of all of these pedagogical practices. So it's from the bottom up, and this is actually one of the methodologies that I use, is grounded theory. So in my conception, a linguistic justice approach is a series of pedagogical suggestions that orient, reorient, and attune students' discursive practices to language difference, global geopolitical and social contingencies, and cross-cultural rhetorics. So if you remember those 5 points, it's derived from those 5 points. So linguistic justice implicates an enactment of the politics of difference, defined not only in US terms, but rather developed across rhetorical traditions and writing cultures, including writing disciplines. In a linguistic justice frame, this is very important for us. Both actions are needed, both a critique of monolingualism and integration. Sometimes we kind of do just critique, okay? And that's sometimes, I'm very good at critiquing. I just have a critical eye. I don't know, I think it's my Eastern European background. I was born under communism, so we critiqued everything. But the second part is equally important, because it's if you tear down something, what are you building up? Okay, so that's why I emphasize this double nature, critique and integration of plurilingual practices and theories. They are essential in centering and valorizing linguistically rich practices. So if I think if this is one point that you remember, I think that's one key point amongst several other. All right, so a linguistic justice approach then, it's, as I mentioned, it's derived from all of the points, and it's not the right time for me to cover all of the 5 points, and I don't think you can plank enough for that. I think you can, but I'm not going to test that. So I'm just going to focus on number 2 and number 4. So I just want to remind you with what those are, okay? So one is methods of writing instruction, the fact that transnational scholars come with this lens of critiquing methods of instruction in the US. And then the second point, the second major point, so this is practice. We moved from policies, we moved to practice, cross-linguistic approaches. So the first one, methods of writing instruction and assignments. In discussing this, I found that many instructors with transnational experience critique argument-based papers, discussion-based seminars, or other activities that were discussion-based. And also the teaching of grammar, not just the grammar, with only standard American English rules. Okay, so it's a specific kind of grammar. With regard to discussion-based assignments, the critique reveals that students from cross-cultural and international backgrounds can be alienated because of unequal participation or limited oral skills in ensuring a truly democratic dialogue. Silence, one scholar explains, can often be equated to deficiency. And I'm sure you've heard this before, right? If you're quiet, if you don't participate, that means you don't have anything to say or you don't understand, or so a deficiency model. Also, students coming from home cultures where power relationships between students and teachers are hierarchical will face more difficulty in this type of discussion because voicing views different from the instructors often denotes interference or disrespect. As a result, students with such beliefs avoid participating actively in the class. The argument-based or thesis-driven papers have also received criticism. Instead, two scholars from Nepal, now both at US institutions, proposed a review essay exploring multiple perspectives where students write about an issue without taking a position. So it's a matter of like looking at different angles and accounting for different stakeholders connected to the particular issue. These scholars also acknowledge that learning new genres, such as the argument-based paper, takes time. And sometimes I think we have to understand it's not necessarily a direct rejection of a particular genre or a particular type of assignment. It's a critique of time, the fact that we are expected to do that in a very short time. And then finally, another scholar referred to what I propose as a linguistic justice move is that there's a need for adaptation. So he called this a series of, quote, intercultural, interlinguistic, and inter-academic adaptations, unquote. So we notice the repeated phrase of this inter, between, moving between and among languages and cultures. Another example of writing assignments, and this one is particular to writing genres that I'd like to provide here, comes from comparative genre work and writing cultures in Europe. The approach is slightly different from the one that I presented earlier. So that comes from transnational scholars teaching in the US. This comes from transnational scholars outside of the US. So there's lots of studies in Europe that I've just become interested recently because I was noticing authors' last names coming from Eastern Europe. So I was recognizing names in Romanian, and I was interested because I left Romania 20 years ago, and I was just interested in the work that they were doing there. So Bekar et al. Compares educational genres in 3 countries, 2 in Eastern Europe, Romania and Ukraine, and 1 from Southern Eastern Europe, Macedonia. And I was just fascinated by, this is one table in which this comparison how this comparison is presented. And we see that note-taking, so writing to learn is one, it's the priority 1. It's used across languages, across countries, and across disciplines, okay? So what is important for us to consider is that work done in this study on genre it accounts for all these variations, right? But what I really liked, we might be tempted to say, oh, this is work across languages. But this is just fascinating work that they presented here. And I was really interested in what they said here. Much more than a particular language, writing is determined by matters including the effects of educational ideologies and traditions, the type of control a country exerts on the educational system, conceptions of literacy development, and the involvement of students into interdisciplinary conversation, the assessment procedures, language policy, and the degree of explicitness of teaching writing. So if you take each one of these, it's not just language. There's so much more that we look at when we look at an assignment, when we look at a practice. So this study also presents two important contextual frames. They offer context on each country and its educational system and a few historical details, such as, for instance, they mention Macedonia's independence from former Yugoslavia in 91. They also mention Romania's educational system that followed a French model due to Romanian language affiliation with French being a Romance language. So these are just some little bits contextual information that helps us understand and position ourselves in relationship to writing and writing assignments and genres. To wrap up, when it comes to writing assignments and writing genres, transnational scholars critique US-based assignments, while other transnational scholars in transnational spaces offer a comparative critique that is highly contextual. And that's really important work here. So this is the first practice that I wanted, the practice of critiquing and looking at assignments. And then the second one is looking at cross-linguistic approaches, rhetorical traditions. So this is the broader area. This is where we go. We can still stay in the classroom, but we're talking about curricula. We're talking about larger, broader changes and reforms. So I will exemplify linguistic justice expressed through these global changes at the curriculum level and engaging national and global reforms. And this is a point that I kind of mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth repeating. In my research, US-based transnational scholars approach linguistic justice work at the micro level in the classroom, at the level of assignments and specific lessons. However, many transnational scholars in international settings took actions that were more global in nature, engaging diverse rhetorical traditions and those reforms. For instance, one of my respondents explained that the teaching of writing in Romanian is a terminology chaos, that's his wording, which he attributed, he said, to the lack of writing tradition. Further on, the scholar refers to the French tradition and later to the Anglo-Saxon. This is, by the way, his phrase. So this is not me labeling what he said as Anglo-Saxon. This is his wording actually in English, even if the interview was conducted in Romanian. So he says, this has to do with the fact that there's no writing tradition in Romania. He says, this has to do with the French influence that was fairly strong, that at some point configured our institutions. This is what the French influence did. It made us so that Romania would not talk about writing. So if anyone is French here, I apologize. But then he says, so Romania would not talk about writing. Writing was learned through imitation. And I think we're familiar with that as well, right? Writing through imitation. So we don't talk about it, we just imitate what these standard models are set for us, right? So he also mentions that in his writing courses, he includes a bibliography composed of texts written in Romanian by Romanian authors, but also by English authors, such as Swales and his well-established rhetorical moves. This openness towards Anglo-Saxon and the English influence is interesting, especially since he is a professor of Romanian studies with a background in French language and literature. Yet despite his affiliation with the French, we find him offering a critique of the French influence on Romanian writing culture and an embrace of the Anglo-Saxon writing. With this example, I hope to show two things. Number one, writing in countries or cultures that have often found themselves at the margins, in this case, Eastern Europeans at the margins of Europe, will often seek affiliation with larger, more visible writing cultures. And this is a form of achieving legitimization, of wanting to be seen, wanting to be acknowledged. Number two, many scholars from Europe and Latin America, because this is where my work has taken me, for instance, in Colombia, they engage with reforms and changes such as the Bologna process. So now you probably understand, I mentioned several times, global reforms. The Bologna process really changed the writing scene in Europe, right? Yeah. Okay, so, and then in Colombia, it's both the civil war, but also the technological driven global changes as well. So, and again, the time does not allow me to speak so much to this, but I found this reference to Anglo-Saxon rhetoric, to German rhetoric, and to French rhetoric over and over in literature on writing in Europe. So a lot of these smaller countries and languages that may be more minor often find their way of we write or we speak like the Germans, like the French, like the, and there's of course there's lots of problems with, as we know, from comparative rhetorics and other of comparing or equating languages to countries. I'm aware of that. So it does, space does not allow me to go into that critique today. But finally, my research shows that the role of the instructor is significant. Okay, elsewhere, I have argued that transnational scholars hold a critical role in advancing linguistic justice in theory and practice because of their experience and identity that works across languages and cultures. However, I believe that this work of linguistic justice advocacy is open to everyone. And this is the beauty of it. It is particularly important to WAC scholars because you already work and operate in writing cultures of particular disciplines. In yesterday's talk, WAC past, present, and future, I think many of you have attended, the speakers talked about boundary brokering. And I'm referring to the same thing here, the same conception, with an acknowledgement that we have linguistic, cultural, disciplinary, national, and all sorts of boundaries. I like to be specific. Boundaries, like we have to name them, what they are in order to be able to broker them, right? So my charge to you is to consider not only knowledge and disciplinary boundaries, but also language or literacy brokering. Time, again, does not permit for me to go into brokering. I do have work that has been published on this, and I really hope that that more folks will take up on this, because linguistic justice work can only be done through brokering. And that's important for us. So remember my embassy story. Even if one person speaks the right language for the right context, systems may be set in place that create unequal access and inability to speak for oneself. And that's why we need this boundary brokering, if you want, okay? Each one of us today may be on a different linguistic justice journey. My linguistic justice work stems from my background as a transnational scholar. Yours may be different. Mine has been influenced by students' right resolution in the US, has developed over time through community-based writing and pedagogy in South Florida, a context where multilingualism is thriving and celebrated. It continues to be refined and revised by work across pedagogies, languages, and cultures. Each one of these aspects shape my view of linguistic justice. As a side note, for me as a transnational scholar, when I first read the Students' Right resolution, I actually didn't react very well to it because I was thinking, I don't have any right. I grew up in Eastern Europe where this rhetorics of rights was not in my language. In fact, because of my geopolitical identity, I've always been placed in situations where I didn't have the right to. So I grappled with this conception of rights, but also it helped me think, where could I and how can I tell my students they have this right if I myself did not know I had the right and I could exercise it in practice? So again, this is just particular to each one of us individual journeys in terms of linguistic justice. That's my story. Yours may be different, but it's equally important. So far I've showed that change within the system is important work because of all the work across organizations. It's slow work as we move from theory to practice, and as sometimes we stall because our practices do not follow theory. And finally, change within the system is persistent work. And as I mentioned earlier, now I'm coming back to the Students' Rights Resolution. That resolution, I mentioned, that created an opportunity for international perspectives to flourish. So the resolution also shaped a series of future policies to which I will refer now. If we follow the evolution of students' rights, we notice a lot of activity in the 70s, some activity in the 80s, and now in the last 3 years, there's a boom of linguistic justice policies. So since 2020, the exigence for linguistic justice has been occasioned by pressing political, economic, and social movements. So since I mentioned that the last 3 years, we have there's been both what I call a deepening and an expansion of linguistic justice policies to different domains of our work. So I'm not going to refer to all of them. So for instance, the first one or the latest one in 2023, it shows an expansion. The reason why I'm saying expansion, because you can see here that the statement is in support not just of students, but of staff and faculty. Students' right refer only to students, right? And then we also have here 2022, the citation justice project, okay? And earlier I was in a panel about publication, and citation justice came as an issue. So you can see how these policies now have deepened and have expanded the initial work on students' rights. So then there's more work, and you know, you can find all of these policies. And I actually want to emphasize a particular one, 2020, this ain't a statement, this is a demand for Black linguistics justice. If you access just that one policy, it's gonna lead you to probably a dozen other policies that are linked to it because there's so much work that has been done. All right, so just fascinating work. But just in the last 3 years, this is just in the last 3 years. Okay, this is our moment now. The history of students' rights resolution taught us that systems can change, but also that if we wait too long, the conditions favoring good change can dissipate. Today, we don't have one policy. We have more than a dozen policies on linguistic justice. As we transition into the next 50 years, I ask, how will WAC work look like if today, each one of us takes one policy, one of these policies listed here, you take it at heart and you take it to practice? Or if you're not a policy person, if you take one assignment, and with that assignment and with that policy, you ask, How can I reframe this with a linguistic justice approach in mind? Where is linguistic justice needed in my work? And what can I do to broker that work? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ligia. That was really, really thought-provoking, interesting. We love to hear from you on that topic, and much like Julia's, to go on a certain journey through the history of the development of these ideas. That's very valuable. Thank you so much. We are down to 3 items. Can you believe it? 3 things. Okay. So 1 is fun. It's going to be a raffle for 3 books. 2, I'm going to just remind you that there is an edited collection, which we would invite your contributions to. So on your tables, you'll see we have writing worldviews and the instructions there, and just to outline a little bit, that we have there will be calls for completed manuscripts, as I understand it, in November of this year. The final manuscripts are due in February of 24, and with publication expected in early 25. So we hope you consider contributing, because it'll be great if you do. All right, sorry, I better talk a little bit energetically. It's 1 o'clock, or we're getting on here, and we need to get going. So let's do the raffle next, and then I'll have closing remarks, and they're very short. So we are giving away 8 books, and they are up here. And so we don't have the first person get to select, and then the last person get no selection. I'm going to call out all 8 numbers, and then just wait at and then you can come up and fight over the votes. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, here we are, and our numbers are, so the first number is 551723. Wonderful, great, Chris, thank you. So the next one, oh no, let's see. Okay, well, I'll mix up better next time. The next number is 551724. Oh, I was afraid. I was afraid it might be too near there. Okay, I'm going to jumble it up here. The next one is 551716. Okay, there you are. Yay. All right. All right, the next one is 551803. That person still here? They have had to leave. Okay, I'm going to draw another then. The next one is 551807. Okay, great. Number 4. Here we go. Number 5 is 551815. Okay, great. All right. Number 6 is 551813. All right. Yay. And let's see, that was 2 more. Number 7 is 551714. That person's still here? No. All right, here's number 7 again. 551812. Okay, here we go. And the last one is 551728. All right, great. There we go. All right. So I will invite our runners in just a minute. I'm going to say, wait a minute. My closing remarks are so short that I'm just going to go ahead and give those and then let you dash up there. Okay. So this has been a wonderful opportunity to get together, to see and talk with old friends, to meet new people who will become new friends and colleagues. I thought you would like to know that you are a group that is on the move and working in the active mode. This, I know, is not a surprise to you, but I was confirmed in this discovery by making a survey of the session titles. And I read there that you are studying, reinforcing, transforming, designing, crafting, writing, transitioning, inventing, improving, reimagining, addressing, cultivating, creating, challenging, crossing, rethinking, managing, tracing, advancing, and taking risks. The last, taking risks, may best describe the innovative plans and programs that you've been discussing in this week. In any case, the titles attest to amazing dynamism, all those INGs, and so much activity. Thank you, thank you, thank you for bringing all that energy to this conference. It has been incredibly electrifying to be part of the sessions and conversations that have taken place over the last 4 days. I thank you for your time, your commitment, your enthusiasm, your generosity. And although I would never undervalue the amount of work that my co-directors put in place in establishing the infrastructure for the conference, and a shout out to Sarah, Allison, and our departed IT person, Chris Wilson. I would say that after all, a conference is only as good as its participants, and you've been amazing. So I wish you all safe travels to home or to your next destinations, and look for conference evaluations in your inbox, and please, please stay in touch. Thank you so much.